So I just want to continue on some of the things that we were talking about last week about how early modern English culture is kind of bound together, as in what are its different constituents. We talked about different aspects of it, such as different parts of the communities, the ways in which communities are tied together. I want to finish off with a couple more options. We were going quite small on the micro level, and now I want to talk a little bit about some of the macro level and talk about what links some of these communities together, as Keith Wrightson talked about many years ago. Of course, if you have read any of the sort of 17th and 18th century writers, especially maybe some of the Jane Austen kind of era kind of thing, you would have heard people talking about going out of the country, and what they actually mean is going out of their county. People who are considered, if you remember the example we had last week about Caxton when he was going north of the River Thames or north of London, and how they came into Kent and they found some people who had been there and did not understand what they were talking about. They thought they were French. In fact, they were English, but they were just talking about eggs in a different language. In the same way, people who lived in different counties were counted as foreigners. And while it is undoubtedly certain that other people from other countries would have made themselves available to other people during this time period in England, whether you would have met one of those is slightly up for grabs. Nonetheless, when we talk about countries, and people talk about going to countries, and in England we talk about countries, we sort of mean a distinctive area, a distinctive geographical area. Now, England is broken down into different shires and, different counties, and I will show some of those counties. They're also called shires. Some of them actually have shire in the name, such as Newbold College is in Berkshire, or Berkshire as it's pronounced. But there are some other counties out there which are not that way, but we'll talk about them some other time. It's not so incredibly important now. But geographically, we are broken up into different counties and different geographical areas. And what I thought I'd do is show you a typographical a topological map. Sorry, let me just share my screen, and let me show you what we're looking at. Here is a picture which I hope you can see, which is most of England. In fact, it's most of England going up into Scotland. It's quite a way away, and you can see just by looking at this that we are quite incredibly flat, comparatively speaking. At least down here in the southern areas, we are quite flat. And as we go up into what's sort of the Midlands area, which is this area here, going up into the north, it gets more bumpy and difficult. As you go into Wales, quite mountainous, and as you continue up into Scotland, with a couple of areas such as sort of this section here, and maybe some parts up here, it is largely all mountainous. And though that's sort of geographically how things would be sort of set up. And we are broken up into different landscapes topographically. Now, actually, what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring that back again and talk about that a little bit more. Here we go. So often different areas are responsible for different economic outputs, depending on where you live, depending on what area you come from. That is largely going to dictate the kinds of things that you will do in that area. And that sounds like a very obvious truism. But for example, if you come from a place that produces largely sheep, you're going to end up, in the sheep business of some sorts. If you come from an industrial area, like later on up in this area up here around Sheffield and Manchester, going much later on actually, these will become heavy industrial areas. These tend to be the agricultural areas, and you can sort of see how that might work. However, during this time we have a number of different things. So different parts of England produce different things. This area up here, which I'm sort of vaguely circling with my mouse, that was responsible for lead mining. In fact, if you still go up in that area, you can still go into some of the old lead mines, or you can find them sort of dotted about the place. Down here in the south, west down here, tin used to be mined. A little bit further down here. That goes back to Roman times. The Romans came all the way up to Cornwall and they took 10 from there and took it around the Roman Empire. But like in our time period, at least, we've got some coal coal up in the north, generally speaking, but there are some other places in Wales that produce this. There are some metalworking industries around Birmingham and the Midlands, so this area here. So much so that Henry VIII was responsible. Sorry, Henry VIII often asked the metal producing areas to produce arrowheads for him when he invaded Scotland in 1523, and they obliged. So these things are generally limited to particular areas. Particular areas specialize in certain things. There is another quite ubiquitous crop of wool, and the woolen cloth and the cloth industry is quite important. I think mostly because everybody needs it, and there aren't that many agricultural things you can do outside of growing food. You do stuff with animals, and this is absolutely one of those things. But because there is no sort of factory system set up yet, we have what's called a putting out system, and the putting out system is essentially the different parts of a process which are parceled out, maybe around a village, maybe between villages, or maybe between sort of areas, where different areas would be responsible for a certain part of the process. So I'm going to grossly simplify this, but let's say, for example, the putting out system would be one person growing sheep, another person would shear the sheep, and then somebody would take that wool, it'd be taken along to the next part of the chain, and that wool would be sort of cleaned. And then after the wool was cleaned, it would be taken somewhere else, and it would be carded and sort of made nice, and then it would be spun into some sort of thread, and then that thread would be turned into a shirt, and blah blah blah. So you have what's called a putting out system, because you'd sort of go around different places and putting out the bits and pieces that you would need to sort of complete these processes. And sometimes that isn't just sort of spread out. It is possible that a lot of those processes might be contained in-house, but in general, I think most people knew a bit about everything, but there would be areas that would have specialized in particular areas, and that's kind of important. We are very heavily into the woolen cloth trade, especially down the south here, and also up in Kent. Around Kent here. So we have these different industries that really kind of define, in a way, the kinds of possibilities and the probabilities that you might have as a person. That's not to say that you cannot jump ship and go somewhere else, but you're not going to start doing metalworking if you live in the far south. You're not going to be doing sheep farming if you're living up in the hills of Wales, although Wales actually later will become quite useful for sheep, but definitely up in Scotland, for example. So geography sort of limits and also helps you choose an area, or chooses for you, might be a more accurate term, the kinds of things that you might be able to do. So geography kind of determines things, and sometimes geography can alter quite drastically your fortunes. England is largely a temperate country in terms of our weather is not too hot or too cold. We are a little bit like Goldilocks' porridge, or rather the bear's porridge that Goldilocks stole. We have a country that is very rarely visited by terrible weather of any sort. We don't have the massive continental snows. We don't have floods, or generally speaking, we don't have floods. We have nothing like hurricanes. We don't have anything, any terrible weather. We are very temperate. Everything is sort of just in the middle, which is great because it means you can do all sorts of things. You don't have to sit out, for example, the entire winter because you're completely frozen out as you might do somewhere else. Now, of course, that is geographically determined too. If you start going around this area in the Midlands, winters will get obviously a lot colder, and the further north you go, the colder it will be too. But in general, we are quite an average country when it comes to that kind of thing. But every now and then we will have natural disasters. We had one when I was small, where we had a hurricane come in and it blew its way all the way across South England and devastated very large parts of the forests and things. which was quite a surprise at the time. Back during the English time, there was a little place, and I think I'm going to sort of wave vaguely around this area over here. There's a place called Dunwich in East Anglia. It's kind of over here, along this coastal section here. And it was a very important port and town during the Middle Ages. It had a Benedictine priory. It had 2 friaries for monks to live in. There were 6 chapels, 6 parish churches, 2 chapels, and a Knights Templar. And so it's a big place. Like there's a lot going on in it. And then in 1328, a storm destroys part of the town, and it shifts enough pebbles and rocks to completely or largely block the harbour, which extinguishes its importance as a harbour town. And in 1347, another storm comes along and it destroys 400 houses and 2 of the churches. And from then on, the town becomes a nothing. It is almost physically wiped off the map, which is very unusual. Although having said that, if you go back in 1066, when the French invaded England, or the Normans invaded England, might be slightly more accurate. We had something called the Domesday Book, which was a list of towns and places and how much they produced, how much money they were worth, and all things like this. And the Domesday Book was it tells us all the names of the places. And if you sort of go forward into the medieval period, you can track how many of those places still exist. And what is quite surprising is how many places simply just disappear completely off the map, or they were sort of big, sort of bustling villages or big bustling towns. But now if you go there, it's 4 or 5 houses, sort of the English equivalent of ghost towns, perhaps. So things can happen. Geographically, yes, it does tell you certain things. Geography can change where you live. We live, and just to give you a random example here, we live around here. And we, up until probably about the 1700s, we used to produce wine. It was hot enough in England to produce wine, and then we had a great cooling off. And then from then on, it was a bit more difficult to do it. We live in, I live in Binfield, where Newbold College is, and we actually have a vineyard here still. But it's not at all on a scale as things used to be in the south of England when we had a lot hotter weather. So just little things like that can completely change how you do things. So geographically, that's what I want to say about geographically. Another thing which, again, I think it was Keith Wrightson talked about, and other people have talked about this too, is the importance of market towns. Now, of course, markets is something that you go to. It's not something that the entire community is built around, but market towns are things that bind communities together. And a town needs all of the hinterland to produce food for it. So all the countryside around a town needs, in a way, people to produce food for it. And they produce food and they produce raw materials. You bring that into the town, and then you sort of convert it. Either it gets converted into something a bit more useful, or it is bought and then shipped to somewhere else where things can be made out of it. And the country depended on these towns really to provide a place for trade, and also as also for specialist manufactures, specialist services of one kind or another. So the essential unit is to think of the market town and its hinterland. Some of these market towns are very small, very tiny, maybe just villages, and that's still important. They have been described by various historians as villages with an overlay of urban activities. These are market villages. So what happens is that at a particular day, maybe on a weekly basis or maybe less, the town will suddenly sprout all sorts of different things and become a market town. And then you have the market takes place, everybody goes home later on, and then the village reverts itself back to its sort of normal village status rather than anything else. Most villages would probably have somebody who does something in metal smithering. You'll have a metalsmith, a blacksmith rather. You might and probably will have some sort of carpenter. You may have a wheelwright, somebody who makes wheels for carts. But there are other larger things that, larger skills that may need a larger market. And so people, for example, who make barrels, coopers, or maybe some of the people who dye cloth. people who make furniture. So all of these things are very necessary, because that is how a village comes together. It's made out of things. You need things. Without those things, villages obviously don't survive very well. And what you'll find is that most people live to a market farm. Most people live within possibly 2, maybe 3 hours walk of a market town of some sort, either a market village or a market town. And sometimes markets will connect or be bound together around other markets. There's a man called Alan Everett who talked about something called cardinal markets. Cardinal markets are these what were termed supernodes, markets which attract other markets around them. So think of it like some sort of a major town with satellite markets around it. And in North Yorkshire, which is sort of, let me sort of go up, well, kind of up here-ish, this area up here, a little lower. Here's Yorkshire is where we kind of get the idea from, but this area is Yorkshire. There is a town called Richmond, which has been very well studied. It's in the middle of what's called the Yorkshire Dales, which is a very pretty part of the country. Lots of sheep. And what it did is that it channeled the relationship between these two areas. You've got the Yorkshire Dales, the Highlands and the Lowlands, essentially. And the sheep and the cows, of course, produce certain things. In this particular case, of course, we have a particular cheese which comes from the area called Wensleydale. And the Wensleydale is made from sheep's milk, or at least used to be. I don't know if it still is. I'd have to check in a supermarket. Anyway, so you'd have all these sheep. You'd have this wool. You'd have this milk, and it would be coming down from the Highlands. The sheep would be they bring all the stuff down into Richmond, and at the same time there'd be other things coming up like cloth and grain coming out of it in exchange. And so it acts as a nexus between two different places. Different things come in and they get exchanged and they sort of go out the other side. And this is how supernodes work. Markets bind villages into localities. Localities get bound into counties, and counties sort of get bound together to sub-regions. So that's definitely one societal way which which market towns and things are sort of can affect or are affected by the geography and vice versa. There's also one topic which is very interesting, or can be very interesting, where we look at how people can be bound together via, well, some sort of societal mobility, which is a whole topic on its own. If you imagine a rich man who has 6 or 7 children, which is probably quite normal for the time period, because he probably would have lost quite a few in early childhood. But let's say he ends up with 6 or 7 who've managed to make their way all the way to adulthood, and he wishes to marry them off. Well, the problem is, if you're a rich person, you don't want to marry down, so you have to find other people who would at least fit the same sort of societal level as you are, because you're rich. And so you marry your children off to equally rich people. And he won't be able to do it in his area. There's just too many children and not enough people who are of a similar level. So what you would have to do is go outside of your parish. And so maybe within a generation or two, that family will be spread out over a wide area. And of course, each family member would visit a different market, and they would spread and collect information that way. So what you would have is, if you could imagine all these people around an area, what you'd have is people all who would have their fingers into sort of like the information pies in each section. And of course, they then get together, meet and exchange this information. So you might know quite a lot of what's going on within a sort of a 30-mile radius. As a rich person, at least. Of course, if you're poorer, it may not be the same thing. It may just be slightly, maybe slightly reduced, but people were very interested in finding out what was going on. People were very interested in finding out the news. So if somebody new comes into an area, then they would be pressed for the latest and greatest of what has ever come by that way. And I don't know about you. I think maybe the popularity of certain ancestry things have sort of come to the fore in the last sort of 10 years or so. But nowadays, I think most people would be hard pressed to name their second cousins. But back then, you probably would have known your third and your fourth cousins quite well. And that again would have given you a further societal network of people, a way of binding people together, because you would have had something in common at some point. You would have had a great grandfather, I think it is. We just don't have those ties. At least we don't. At least in many Western countries, we don't have those ties anymore. We just simply don't know anybody, and yes, it can get kind of complicated. So that's sort of what a nation might look like. One thing I would like to talk about finally, I'm just going to end sharing here, is to really talk about some of the sort of the main political things. We talked about how society is bound together by that, but there are echelons at the top of society who really are, sorry, the cat is meowing, who really, you have to understand what these things are. And I think maybe just for your classes, this might be very useful to know. There are political offices, and there are different kinds of political offices, and it's important who you know and what they do, or at least roughly what they do, because this is going to come into play, especially in all of your reading. If you're keeping up with this, then you would have come across some of these different offices. Perhaps the first and most important one is the exchequer, which normally has a treasurer, a main treasurer of it, and what are known as barons of the exchequer. And the purpose of this is to deal with money. And money comes about by taxation, and taxation comes along by calling parliaments, who then go out and say, right, okay, well, you can levy £10,000 or whatever percentages you like. So you as a king, Henry VIII, needs some money. He calls together parliament. Parliament says, yes, you can, let's go out and do this. Then all the money comes in. The exchequer deals with this. The exchequer deals with taxation. And it's important to note there's no such thing as a sort of an income tax per se. It's not like a taxation now where everybody gets taxed every month, every year, or everybody everywhere. It's normally just specifically levied at particular points for particular purposes. Now, one of the great innovations much later on will be the levying of a tax that goes across everybody, not just sort of a group of people. Kind of everybody gets it. And the exchequer also deals with the king's debts. And while, yeah, pretty much all the Tudors, in fact, were all horrendously in debt, they kept trying to get out of it, and various catastrophes kept happening, and they kept having to sort of get money somewhere, but they couldn't. And so they ended up in debt a lot. And this is going to cause trouble later on by the time we get to the Stuarts. But they also dealt with, so they dealt with taxation, they dealt with the debts, they dealt with revenue. Obviously, kings may take a continuous percentage of certain things, of certain monopolies, for example. Or an exchequer might actually facilitate royal credit. So you want to go do something, you might say approach one of the local barons, or even a baron who's far away who has plenty of money, and say, hello, I'd like to, I'm looking to do something. I would like some money, and they may give you a loan or something along those lines. And the exchequer kind of does this. The exchequer spawns what's known as the chamber. The chamber becomes really the center of royal finance. It's quite flexible. Its function again is to deal with royal revenue, profits from justice, and feudal dues. And a lot of this is kind of very technical information you don't sort of really need to know, but just need to understand that the exchequer deals with money, and he deals with how he gets money and how money is sort of dealt with in and out of there. One of the other major political offices is the Chancery. The personnel in that is the Lord Chancellor, who is what's known as the Keeper of the Rolls. And under him, he has a number of clerks who keep county records. Now, as I said very early on at the beginning, I think in one of the earlier lectures, the Tudor period is a time when we see an explosion, relatively speaking, of information that's kept. Now, it's true, you can certainly find the rolls going back earlier to this and quite substantially before this, but the Tudor period is a time where this really goes out, and we have lots of county records. And if you ever get into sort of local histories, you will have to go through the county records maybe to look at things. But the Lord Chancellor is the keeper of, he's the keeper of the rolls and also the keeper of the royal seal. so the Lord Chancellor is there, and you've got the Keeper of the Rolls under him, and then you've got the Keeper of the Royal Seal under him, and the Keeper of the Royal Seal acts in the Chancellor's absence. And seals are very important. You can't sort of do things if you don't have a seal to sort of stamp your authority over things. I think I can't remember which king it was. I want to say it's James III, or maybe it was, I can't remember. One of the Stuarts, I think. When he fled the country, he took the royal seal with him, which meant that no governing could take place without somebody sort of having a proper seal. I'm not sure how they got around it. He threw it in the river, I think, in the Thames River as he was escaping. I don't think it stopped anything, but at least it was, the idea of it was there. Anyway, so the Chancery issues writs. Writs are very important, and they are multifunctional. A writ, and you'll come across this in your reading for Anne Boleyn, are mostly to do with law and order and with rights and duties. And so they are incredibly important, at least at the higher levels of things. The Chancery also spawns the King's Secretary, who is the person who sort of keeps the royal seal, which I said is kind of important. So you've got the Exchequer, you've got the Chancery, and you've got the King's Council. The King's Council is normally a group of people or advisors from the greater nobility, so the very top levels of the dukes, the barons, the marquises, and that level. And they are very important. And from the 14th century up into the 14th century, they're very important. But from the 14th century, they decline and Parliament becomes more important at this point. And so the King's Council has a number of different spin-offs, so to speak. The Marches of Wales, that's the name of it. The Councils of the North, the Star Chamber, and the Privy Council. And the one probably I'm going to spend the most time on is the Privy Council, which sort of has it's probably the most important one. Privy, of course, is the closest group of people closest to the king. They are the truest continuation of the King's Council. And in Tudor, one of the innovations of the Tudor period is that we tend to see quite a bit of centralization. And this is one of the examples of of things that previously had been sort of spread out on the sides, now coagulating into one cohesive group that sort of does everything. And it becomes the main permanent institution of the government. It sat almost every single day of the year. It had about up to 19 people in it of various importance and of various, skills and responsibilities. And the functions of it really are to look after the realm. They are to advise the ruler and to work out the administration of everything. And it is the absolute superior administrative authority in England, Wales, and Ireland. The Privy Council also appointed magistrates in the localities, and sometimes served as justices of the peace in various counties as well, which are kind of fairly high levels of judicial involvement. By the time we get to Elizabeth's reign, Privy Councillors are both leaders of both the court and in the country, which is an interesting bleeding over, because you normally had court, you normally had the country, and they were kind of separate. But we begin to see how those separations really begin to deteriorate by Elizabeth's time. They build up lots of networks in the counties, and they involve themselves in all sorts of sort of local issues. So that's one of the first things they did. The second thing they did was, this is a little bit later on in the Tudor period, so about 1554, the Privy Council assumes responsibility for finance, for fiscal matters, where Henry VII, so just before Henry VIII, obviously, he had checked his accounts page by page in the chamber and in the Privy Council. In the Privy Chamber, the Privy Council managed finance in conjunction with the Lord Treasurer and the Court of the Exchequer. So what you can sort of see is that the kings, I'm not going to say that the kings are losing control or responsibility for things, but it is being taken away from them. And they may have given it away freely, or it's just one of those things where the king sort of says, okay, you deal with this. But they are beginning to do it. And so this is why this is part of the whole sort of Tudor reorganization. The Privy Council also managed national defense and fortifications. So, for example, in 1544, they were recruiting armies. They were training people in 1573. These are they're now taking over the defense aspects of things. So just one council again taking part of it. They also took control over management and deploying of the crown patronage. The crown obviously would at various points say, right, I like you very much. I will give you some money as a pension, and that will enable you to do whatever it is that I like that you're doing. So the Privy Council would took over this. They also enforced the Reformation, which of course comes a little bit later on in our time period, but is still very important. They surveyed justices of the peaces and the other county and municipal officers in 1564 to try and find out and get information about what was going on, who was keeping the laws, the new religious laws and whatnot. So yes, they did a number of different things. The Privy Council is very important. It looks after law and order. It does regulates economic affairs such as the poor laws. It sort of looks after fixed wages and prices of things. It regulates internal trade, those market towns and whatnot. It's very important. They controlled vagrancy. Vagrancy is really for people who move from one place to another. We talked about the manorial system and how people generally tended to be tied to one area. That's in the medieval period, but by the time we get into the early modern, that is beginning to deteriorate quite significantly. And so people could move around, but there were people who moved around and had no job and didn't do anything. So they were considered vagrants. And they needed to control this because they tended to cause trouble. The Privy Council also organized searches for Jesuits. This again is more in Elizabeth's reign. But there is a general fear that there are groups of Catholics in the country who are plotting to overthrow it, which very often was true. And so they had to deal with that. The Privy Council also managed Parliament. And by the time we get to Elizabeth, at least, this management of Parliament by the Privy Council is key to understanding the relationships between Crown and the Parliament during Elizabeth's time. Clashes in Elizabeth's parliaments were at least one way or another a collision. I think this is I've forgotten there's a Tudor historian whose name has just escaped me. John Guy. I think this is John Guy's idea here. Anyway, the parliaments, the clashes in parliaments are really collisions between the ruler and the Privy Council, where the Privy Council is using Parliament against the ruler, not necessarily in an antagonistic we're against each other kind of way, but kind of we need to persuade the Queen of something, so we'll get Parliament to do it, and so it doesn't look like it's not so necessarily coming directly from us. And what else? Yes, so there are a number of things that the Privy Council does, and it's kind of important to see what they can do. It does change across the Tudor period. Much of what we see past about 1540 is a reaction to previous main ministers who had come about during that time period, mostly to do with two ministerial careers of Wolsey and Cromwell. Both of these people were big personalities in Tudor government in the name of Henry VIII, and rather than allowing one person to have so much power, I think the Privy Council kind of develops as a response to make sure that no one person has too much. So by about 1540, Privy Councils could issue proclamations and administrative orders in the name of the king. It could govern the realm by state paper. And what that means is by writing letters or issuing warrants, which are signed collectively by the group. And so, yes, by the time we get to Mary and Elizabeth, after Henry VIII, obviously, They even had their own seal, so they could sort of stamp their own documents and get on with it. So yeah, that's a little bit about how the nation is bound together, what binds people together, and a little bit about how that nation and those communities are governed a little bit. There's obviously an awful lot more than just this, but at least it gives you an idea roughly what it should be. But we'll maybe come across some more of these things, because this is not an intensely political class. We're not going to talk too much about this, but it's important that you understand at least some of the concepts abound before we get on any further. Right, that's it for now, and I'll see you next time.